In 2012, Hannah and I took a trip out to Colorado. And 2012 was a time before smartphones had GPS map apps on them, and we didn't own an individual GPS device. So what we did is we got on the internet, because we called it the internet back then, and we got on MapQuest.com. When I say we, it's me. I need to make sure I take ownership for this. So I got on MapQuest.com, and I printed off directions. On the way to Colorado, we were going to go to Kansas City, stop for the night, then continue on, going through I-70. On the way back, we were going to come on I-80. It's a little longer on I-80, but we're going to do some sightseeing on the way. So the first night, we make it to Kansas City, no problem. And then we get in the road the next day traveling, and we realize that I had not printed the directions from Kansas City to Colorado. I had printed directions from Colorado to Kansas City. And the problem with when you've printed directions is you can't just go to your phone and say reverse the order. So we were stuck with that. Now, for the most part, it wasn't that big of a deal. When you're on long stretches of interstate, it's pretty clear what you're supposed to do. But then when you get down to the nitty-gritty on the turns, you've got to do some reverse engineering to figure out how to turn and where to go. Now, we made the trip, for the most part, without incidents. But there were some bumps along the road trying to make sure that we got to where we needed to go. And as I think about that experience, trying to navigate with directions that were the reverse of what we needed, it makes me think sometimes I feel that's how life is. We go through life and we have these directions. We have these things that we're trying to accomplish, but sometimes we feel as though the directions are incomplete, or they're the wrong way, or there's something missing from that. Because that's how life feels. And when you think about leadership, of leading others, and the direction that we are called to go, and how we navigate that, we can learn a lot from Moses. Moses is probably one of, if not the best leaders in the Bible, except for Jesus. So we've got to take him out of the equation when we're evaluating humans. But Moses was the top of the top. But he didn't always start that way. Now, when Moses was born, he spent the first 40 years of his life as a prince of Egypt. Egypt was the leading world power at the time. Then after 40 years, he fled Egypt as a fugitive and went to the wilderness where he lived as a shepherd. He lived a quiet, anonymous life, trying to live out the rest of his years for the second 40 years of his life. Then after that, God really disrupted Moses. And he called Moses to go back to Egypt to lead the Israelites out of slavery from the Egyptians, because the Israelites had been enslaved for 400 years to the Egyptians, and God said, go and lead them. Moses was hesitant and expressed those hesitancies to God, but God eventually convinced Moses that he should do this, he should be obedient. So Moses goes, and he has these conversations with Pharaoh to let my people go, and eventually the Israelites say, hey, leave us alone. It may not be great, but if you keep meddling, it's going to get worse. So they tell him to leave, but Moses stays true to what God had called him to do. But Pharaoh didn't want the Israelites to leave. They were his slaves. There were 1 million to 2 million slaves. He didn't want to just let those people go. So through Moses, God brought the 10 plagues on Egypt and ravaged the nation. And after the 10 plagues, Pharaoh finally let the Israelites go. And so they flee Egypt, and they're going, and then Pharaoh has a change of mind, and Pharaoh comes, and he takes his army to go pursue the Israelites to bring them back to Egypt. Well, the Israelites find themselves at the Red Sea. The Red Sea was on one side, and the Egyptian army was closing in on the other side. And the people cry out to Moses, why did you bring us out here to die? Weren't there enough graves in Egypt that you could have just left us there? And they moan and groan and complain. And God brought the miracle and allowed them to cross the Red Sea on dry ground and save them from the Egyptians. And they're free from them now. Then the next chapter we find that they're wandering in the desert. And you know when you're in the desert, water is precious. They come across water, but it's bitter. It's unfit to drink. And so they moan and groan and complain and grumble against Moses, and they quarrel. And they say, why did you bring us out here with no water? But God provided a miracle and gave them water to drink. And then after that, there's no food. And they moan and groan and complain and grumble and quarrel against Moses and say, we had pots of meat in Egypt. Why didn't you let us stay there? And God brought food through manna, it's bread from heaven, and quail. Then after that, they didn't have water again, and they grumble and complain and quarrel again. But God brought water time and time again. God provided for them, even though they grumbled and complained and quarreled. God still continued to provide for them. Then after that, Moses ascends Mount Sinai and has this meeting with God. This is where Moses received the 10 Commandments and where he received other commandments from God. And God descended upon the mountain in smoke and fire and thunder. It wasn't just one of those things that was, oh, there's a storm. It was God's power was present on the mountain. But after Moses was on the mountain for a long time, the Israelites got nervous. And so they said, what are we going to do? So they decided to put a bunch of gold together, and they construct an idol at a golden calf, and they worship it. And it makes God and Moses frustrated. So we get to Exodus chapter 33 right after this. And God tells Moses, he says, hey, you go take these people to the promised land. But I'm not going to go with you. These people are frustrating, and I may destroy them along the way. So Moses takes a step back from that. And he realizes what God is calling him to do. And so he goes and he has a meeting with God. And in that meeting with God in Exodus chapter 33, starting in verse 12, he goes to the Lord and he says, you have been telling me to take these people to the promised land, but you haven't told me whom you will send to go with me. You have told me, I know you by name and I look favorably on you. If it is true that you look favorably on me, let me know your ways so that I may understand you more fully and continue to enjoy your favor. Remember that this very nation is your very own people. And the Lord replied, I will go with you personally, and I will give you rest. Everything will go well with you. So Moses recognizes that he can't do this alone. God has brought them on this journey that included a lot of crazy things. Read the book of Exodus. It is just awesome to see what God did in and through Moses. And it's a very exciting book, a very engaging book. But Moses realized, he said, I can't do this by myself. See, God, you're telling me to do this, but if you can't come with me, I can't do this. Now, Moses was a leader. He was someone who had things going his way, but he recognized that he needed help. But God, he affirmed that God said, I look favorably on you. I know you by name, that there's a relationship there. It's not as though Moses is just random person off the street. Moses had an intimate connection with God. God knew him personally. He knew him on a very intimate level. That is how deep their relationship was. But God promises to come to Moses. He says, I'm going to give you rest. There's a lot of stress in your life. There are a lot of things happening that may be outside of your control. There are a lot of difficulties that you're facing, but I will give you rest. I will be with you. I will comfort you. And I think Moses was under a lot of stress. I listed a lot of the things that happened up to this point to see that Moses was leading people who grumbled. He was leading people who complained. He was leading people who quarreled. You know another term we can use to describe them? The people of God. That's who they were. These weren't just some heathens. These were people who supposedly believed in God, and yet they caused an extreme amount of stress. They grumbled, they complained, and they quarreled. And in the midst of that, what Moses says, in the midst of frustration, in the midst of stress, in the midst of difficulty, what he does is he seeks God's presence. Because God's presence brings true confidence. Moses was leading over 1 million people. But leading all those people was not what brought confidence in his life, was not what brought fulfillment to his life. It's not what brought relevance to his life. It was resting in the presence of God. Because navigating life is difficult. I think we all can say that navigating life right now is difficult. There are a lot of questions that we're trying to answer. There are a lot of decisions that we are trying to make. And sometimes it gets to the point where we say we don't even know what to do anymore. We don't know how to proceed. We don't know what the next step should be. And maybe you are the one exception in the world right now that you have complete confidence. You've never wavered. But the last year and a half have been difficult. And the frustrating thing is it doesn't seem to be getting any less difficult. It's not as though it's going away. It's not as though the climate in our world is changing in a positive direction. Probably you can even think last 2 years, the toxicity in our world has been growing and growing and growing, and it consumes us more and more and more, and it's hard to even tread water anymore. And Moses is living in a time where it's difficult. But what I find happening is that because of the state of the world, it's causing fear in everybody, and we are being consumed by this fear. Now, I would say that the pandemic is not causing fear, it's causing fear, but the pandemic is not the reason that we are just fearful. Fear was creeping into our world. The pandemic has just exasperated that fear. It's highlighted that fear. It has made that fear more prevalent in our lives. And so Moses is dealing with people who are consumed by fear. And instead of trying to engage in that fear, what he does is he has this meeting with God. And God says, I will give you rest. But Moses goes further. And he says, if you don't personally go with us, don't make us leave this place. How will anyone know that you look favorably on us if you don't go with us? For your presence is what separates us from all people on earth. The Lord replied to Moses, I will do everything you have asked, for I look favorably upon you and I know you by name. So in this setting right now, the Israelites are camped at Mount Sinai. Moses had ascended the mountain to get the Ten Commandments, had this time with God, and now he has descended the mountain, and they are still there in that place. They are in the wilderness. They are in the desert, and Moses goes to God and said, hey, I don't want to go to the promised land if you're not going to go with us. I don't want to leave this place if your presence does not accompany us. Even though it was in the wilderness, even though it was in the desert, Moses had this opportunity to lead this people, lead these 1 million or 2 million people into the promised land to establish a nation. He had this opportunity, but we cannot allow opportunities or ambition or desires or even our needs to get in the way of entering God's presence. Just because we have something over here doesn't mean that we should go over there. We need to make sure that we stay and stop in God's presence first. We cannot do anything else besides that. As Moses affirms, he needs God. He needs God's presence in his life. No matter the leadership accolades that he received, no matter the honor that was bestowed upon him, Moses was irrelevant if he didn't have God's presence in his life. His success was dependent upon God, and so he enters God's presence because he knows that God's presence brings true confidence. It brings understanding for how to proceed, for what the next step should be. Now make sure we recognize, Moses knew God was angry with his people. Moses knew that God wasn't happy with how the Israelites were behaving. And God said, I may destroy them if I go with you. So what Moses does is he recognizes that it's better to be in God's presence, even if it's dangerous, than it is to be away from God's presence in a safe environment. And I think that's a shift in mentality that our culture needs to address. Because we live in a culture that if it's uncomfortable, then there's a problem and we need to fix it. Now, Moses is not saying that we just need to be uncomfortable all the time. What he's saying is we first and foremost need to sit in God's presence. And if that is dangerous, if that causes sacrifice, if that causes inconvenience, then that's exactly where we need to be. We can't leave God's presence just because the grass is greener somewhere else, because there's an opportunity that presents itself. So even though God looked favorably on Moses, even though God knew his name, had this intimate relationship with him, Moses needed to stay in God's presence. God promised to go with them. God said, I will do what you have requested. I will come with you. I will be with you as my people. And with God's presence comes true confidence. Then Moses goes one step further. And he says, then show me your glorious presence. The Lord replied, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will say my name, Yahweh, before you. For I will show mercy and compassion on anyone I choose. But you may not look directly at my face, for no one can see my face and live. The Lord continued, stand near me by this rock. As my glorious presence passes by, I will hide you in the crevice of this rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see me from behind, but you will not see my face. I think that's just a bold ask by Moses. God had just answered two of his questions in a positive way. Hey, I'm going to give you rest. Hey, I'm going to do everything you have asked. I'm going to come with you. And Moses said, hey, show me your presence. Let me have an extra and special encounter with you right now. I firmly believe, even though Moses was an incredible leader, I still believe that Moses would probably admit there were times where he said, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to proceed. I don't know what the next course of action in my life should be. But what he shows us, particularly in this moment, is that whatever was happening, whatever was before him, Moses knew the most important thing was for him to rest in God's presence, was to stay there, was to experience more of God. He wanted more of God so he could understand him more completely. That's what Moses sought. That was his desperation. He wasn't coming to God demanding that God showed him his presence. He was pleading. He was begging for God's presence to come into his life. I think sometimes we forget that most people deal with confidence issues in one level, one shape or form. You know, we have questions about what we should or shouldn't do. You know, should we do this? Should we do that? Today, we are outside. Should we have done this today? I'll let you in on a secret. I have no idea. But what I do know is that in everything we do, regardless if we know what we're doing or not, we need to seek God's presence. It's not about saying, did I make the right decision? It's, am I in God's presence? And if we're in God's presence, even though it may be dangerous, even though it may be inconvenient, that's exactly where we need to be. That's a mentality shift that we need to make. See, Moses seeks God's presence, and with God's presence comes true confidence. And Moses grows in confidence, not because he's making good decisions from a leadership standpoint, but because he's entering God's presence. So Moses has this moment where he is consumed by God. And all of God's goodness passes by Moses. And as I think about this moment that Moses had, we don't really have any other spot in Scripture where we have this type of similar moment happen. There are some that we could talk about and bring them into the conversation, but this was a unique moment. And in order for Moses to have this moment, I think required great humility and submission. I think we as people want to be closer to God. We want more of God in our life, but we're hesitant. We're scared on some level. And so instead of getting the outpouring of God in our life that Moses experienced, we just kind of get the spray mist in our lives of, oh, well, we can feel God. We feel something. It's different. It may cool us off on a hot day, but we're not soaked. And I would say in that moment, Moses was soaked. He was consumed by God's presence. And let's not forget who we're talking about. We're talking about the Almighty God, the creator of heaven and earth. He is the Alpha and the Omega. No one can see his face and live. And Moses had an encounter that nobody else really had. But as I think about God, sometimes I think we forget how great God is compared to us. Let's just think for a moment. You know, we're outside, we've got the sun. Now, unless you have some pretty awesome sunglasses, you can't look at the sun right now. Now, you can look for a moment, and maybe some of you have awesome sunglasses. I don't know. Yeah, kids, don't try that. You can look for a moment, but it begins to hurt your eyes after a while. When Jesus returns, when the new heavens and the new earth come, you know what's going to happen? Is we're not going to be able to see the sun anymore because God's glory is so powerful that the sun won't even need to shine. That's how powerful God is. We can't look at the sun right now, but God's glory is infinitely greater than the sun. That is the encounter Moses had. It's something I hope we long for. I'm not sure we always grasp the magnitude of what Moses did, but he was able to have this experience with the great God, and he was hidden in the rock, in the crevice, and God's hand covered him. But another thing I think that happens is we focus on more of God's omnipresence, the fact that God is everywhere. And I agree with that. God is everywhere. But was this a different experience? Now, we're probably getting into theological jungle here, trying to actually say, is God's omnipresence different from this moment that Moses experienced, that God separated himself and those types of things? I would not classify what Moses experienced as God's omnipresence. I would classify it as God's, what the Hebrew word is Shekinah glory. And Shekinah means a physical manifestation of God. Now, is that still the same thing as omnipresence? We can debate that. I'm not trying to say it's not. But the fact of the matter is God's presence was there. It was unique. It was different. It was so powerful that, you know, when Moses descended from that meeting, when he left that meeting, he walked out of that meeting and his face was glowing with God's glory. It was radiating with God's glory. And he only saw the back of God's cloak. And yet, because of that, his face was glowing. That is the encounter that Moses had. He sought God's presence. And that was as much as Moses' physical body could sustain. And I don't know how Moses felt when he walked out of that meeting. But I'm telling you what, whenever I experience God's presence, I've got confidence. I have encouragement. I have boldness. I have direction. Even though I may not always be right. I'm not trying to be arrogant here in saying that, but the fact is, God's presence brings true confidence. So I asked the question, you know, should we be outside here today? Is that a good decision? Is it necessary? The fact of the matter is, I am confident that no one knows what they're doing right now, regardless of who you're talking about. And so the media pulls us in. You know, 2 years ago, everything used to be President Trump's fault. You know whose fault it is now? President Biden's fault. The media is distracting us in ways that we're trying to blame somebody, and I don't know whose fault it is. And I don't believe anybody really knows whose fault it is. Maybe they do. Maybe I'm ignorant and living under a rock myself. But the reality is, I believe that as the people of God, most people are trying to figure out life in a way that honors Jesus. So what we need to do, above all else, is not give in to the fear of the world, not give in to the anxiety that the world is invoking in our life, but saying, Jesus, we need to seek you, we need to meet you, we need to have an encounter with you. Because if you have an encounter with Jesus, if you have this encounter with God in any way, shape, or form like Moses did, it's going to be life-changing. It's going to be beneficial. It may not put you in a place that's safe. And we have to make sure we recognize that as a risk. When we enter God's presence, it may not be safe. And when we faithfully obey Jesus, we may not be called to safe places. There's a big difference between being where God wants you to be and being in a place that's safe. Moses didn't go to a place that's safe. He went to a place that was consumed with God's presence. But no matter what the future holds, the best place to be is in the presence of God. Whether you're talking about here in our country, whether you're talking about in other countries, whether you're talking about your situation at work, your situation at home, wherever it is, the best place for you to be is in the presence of God. Because no matter what danger happens, the promises that God gave Moses can ring true. I will give you rest. I will be with you. My presence will consume you. And that's what happened to Moses. Now we know the story of Moses continues, and Moses led Israel for the next 40 years. And there was peaks and valleys of his leadership and his decision-making process. But Moses led Israel in a way that honored God, and he continued to honor God all of his life. Not just because of this one encounter. He didn't rely on this one encounter for the rest of his life. He continued to have encounters with God. And so we are here today seeking God. And I pray that you join me on this journey to say, God, I don't know what I'm doing. I just know I need your presence. So we come today to say, Lord, I need you. I need you to consume me. I need your wisdom. I need your guidance.